long before the rise of Greece, Rome, or even the earliest Chinese dynasties. A great civilization thrived quietly along the banks of the Indus River. Between 2600 and 1900 BCE, this land gave birth to one of the world's first urban societies, yet today, its name is barely remembered. The Indus Valley Civilization, stretching across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, rivaled Mesopotamia and Egypt in scale and sophistication, but left behind no great monuments to kings or armies. What it left instead was something far more subtle: cities of brick, streets planned with precision, and a way of life built on order, cleanliness, and quiet strength. The geography of the Indus was both its gift and its mystery. The river carried snowmelt from the Himalayas, spilling into wide floodplains that nourished fields of wheat and barley. Smaller rivers branched outward, watering villages where families grew millet, tended cattle, and planted groves of date palms. Around them stretched deserts and ridges that both isolated and protected their lands. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt or the palaces of Mesopotamia, what defined this civilization were not towering monuments, but the rhythm of daily life shaped by water, soil, and brick. The cities of Harappa in the north and Mohenjo-Daro farther south astonish us even today. Their streets were laid out in straight lines, crossing at right angles like a vast chessboard. Houses were built of uniform bricks, with flat roofs and central courtyards. Most remarkable of all were the drains. Every street had covered channels that carried wastewater away, connecting into larger sewers, an innovation unmatched for centuries elsewhere. In Mohenjo-Daro, the so-called Great Bath, a large tank lined with bricks and filled by a well, hints at ritual bathing, purity, and perhaps community gatherings. In Harappa, granaries stored vast quantities of grain, ensuring food security for thousands. These cities were not built for kings, but for people. To walk their streets 3,000 years ago would have been to witness a calm orderliness, rare in ancient times. In the early morning, families baked flatbreads on clay hearths as smoke curled into the sky. Farmers led oxen yoked to wooden plows, scratching furrows into the earth to sow wheat and barley. Potters spun clay on their wheels, shaping jars and bowls later fired in communal kilns. Metal workers hammered copper and bronze into chisels, knives, and ornaments. Beadmakers drilled stones like carnelian and lapis lazuli into jewelry that glimmered in the sunlight. Merchants gathered in markets, selling surplus grain, jars of oil, bright beads, and woven cloth. Some traveled far beyond the river valleys, for seals from the Indus have been found in Mesopotamia, showing that goods sailed across the Arabian Sea and into the Persian Gulf. Meals were simple but sustaining: bread made of wheat or barley, lentil stews, fruit from orchards, and sometimes fish caught from the river. Cattle and buffalo roamed in herds, providing milk and hides. Goats and sheep grazed in the scrublands, tended by herders who returned each evening to small brick houses that clustered near the city walls. Children played in dusty courtyards with clay toys and carts pulled by tiny wheels, while women spun cotton, the earliest known use of the fiber in the world. What remains striking about the civilization is what we do not see. No giant palaces proclaim the power of rulers. No colossal statues guard the gates. No temples dominate skylines. The seals they left behind, with animals carved beside a short script, tell us little of rulers or gods. The script itself remains undeciphered, an unsolved puzzle of history. The absence of royal monuments suggests that authority may have been shared perhaps among councils of merchants, elders, or priests rather than concentrated in a single monarch. The emphasis was not on glorifying leaders but on maintaining balance within the community. Religion, too, remains an enigma. Figurines of women hint at fertility cults, while carvings of horned animals suggest deities tied to strength and nature. Sacred trees appear on seals, perhaps objects of reverence, and the Great Bath suggests rituals of purification. Without texts, we can only guess. Faith here seems to have been woven into daily life rather than displayed through grand temples. Even warfare seems absent. Unlike Mesopotamian cities surrounded by massive fortifications and records of endless conquest, Indus sites reveal few weapons and little evidence of battles. Their walls were more for flood control than defense. Their cities designed not for war, but for stability. If true, this would make the Indus Valley one of the rare early civilizations that flourished not through conquest, but through trade, cooperation, and order. And so, the first glimpse of this forgotten civilization shows us a world built on brick, water, and community. A society where merchants pressed seals into clay, farmers guided oxen through furrows, women spun thread into cloth, and children played with carved toys in sunlit courtyards. It was not a civilization of kings, but of people who lived their lives in rhythm with the rivers and the seasons. And so we pause with a question. How could such a civilization, one of the largest and most advanced of its time, vanish so completely, leaving only bricks, beads, and an undeciphered script to whisper its story? Beyond the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro stretched a wide web of smaller towns and villages, each carrying its share of the civilization's weight. Life in these smaller places was simple but steady, tied to the land and to the rhythm of seasons. Houses were built of mud brick, clustered in small groups, their roofs flat, their courtyards open to the sky. Families shared space with their animals, chickens scratching in the dust, goats tied near the doorway, and oxen resting after long days of plowing. Smoke rose from hearths each morning, as women ground grain on stone slabs to make flour for bread, while children fetched water from wells and carried baskets of fodder to animals. The farmers of the Indus Valley were skilled in working with both floodplain soils and the more stubborn lands beyond. They grew barley, wheat, and millet, rotating crops as seasons allowed. Fields were irrigated by the natural rise and fall of rivers, but where floods failed, canals and wells gave an extra supply. Cattle, sheep, and goats provided milk, wool, and hides. Chickens, among the earliest domesticated in history, clucked in yards and gave eggs for meals. Life was not rich, but it was stable, and stability in a world so ancient was itself an achievement. The artisans of this civilization added beauty and function to daily existence. Potters shaped jars, bowls, and cups on the wheel, often painting them with simple animal motifs or patterns before firing them in shared kilns. Bead makers drilled stones with precision so fine that their carnelian and agate ornaments still shine today. Bronze smiths hammered copper and bronze into chisels, knives, and bangles. Shell workers carved bracelets from conch and mother of pearl, and ivory carvers shaped combs and ornaments. The famous dancing girl of Mohenjo-Daro, a small bronze figure of a young woman, with one hand on her hip and bangles stacked on her arm, captures something of the confidence and artistry of these people. Clothing was simple but functional. Men wore cloth wrapped at the waist, sometimes with cloaks over their shoulders. Women draped themselves in skirts or lengths of fabric, often adorned with jewelry. Cotton was widely used, making the Indus Valley among the first societies to spin and weave the fiber. Bangles of shell or terracotta, beads of semi-precious stone, and ornaments of bronze were common, suggesting that even ordinary people valued adornment. Hairstyles and oiled combs show that care for appearance was part of everyday life. Meals were modest but nourishing. Wheat and barley were ground into flour and baked into flatbreads. Lentils and chickpeas were stewed with vegetables, flavored with seeds and perhaps early spices. Milk and curd came from cattle and goats. Dates and melons were gathered in season. Fish were caught in rivers, and shellfish were collected near the coast. Mustard seeds, discovered in storage jars, suggest seasoning long before spices were famous elsewhere. These simple diets were supported by an agricultural system that fed not only families, but also the growing cities, trade-tied villages, and towns into larger networks. Farmers brought surplus grain to markets in the cities. Merchants carried beads, shells, and cloth along river boats and carts. At the great port of Lothal, ships likely set sail across the Arabian Sea, connecting the Indus world to Mesopotamia and beyond. Indus seals, with their animal motifs and mysterious script, have been uncovered in faraway lands, proof of a civilization whose influence extended well beyond its valleys. Weights and measures, standardized across hundreds of miles, ensured that exchange was fair. Even without kings to enforce it, the people of the Indus had found ways to trust in uniformity. Religion appears not in temples or idols, but in quiet traces scattered across the settlements. Terracotta figurines of women, likely connected to fertility, were found in homes. Carved seals depict sacred trees and animals, suggesting reverence for the natural world. The Great Bath hints at rituals of cleansing and renewal at Calibangan. Fire altars suggest offerings burned in ceremony. Whatever their beliefs, they seem woven into the cycles of fertility, water, and purity, not separate in monumental temples, but part of everyday life. The most intriguing question remains how such an orderly society was governed. There are no inscriptions praising kings, no palaces towering above the rest, and no evidence of armies carved into walls. And yet, bricks were made to standard dimensions across vast distances. Drains were engineered with uniform precision, and weights and measures were consistent. Some suggest councils of merchants or elders guided decisions. Others believe priests held authority, maintaining order through ritual. Perhaps leadership was shared among many, rather than concentrated in one. Whatever the system, it created harmony that lasted for centuries. To imagine the Indus world in its prime is to see balance, farmers sowing fields, as children played in dust-filled lanes, artisans drilling beads as merchants pressed seals into clay tags, and women spinning cotton in courtyards while priests perhaps bathed in ritual pools. It was a civilization of work and order, not war and conquest, of drains and courtyards rather than thrones and crowns. It thrived not by dominating neighbors but by sustaining itself and trading quietly with distant lands. And so we pause with a question. How could such a society, whose strength lay in its balance and calm, disappear so completely that for thousands of years its very name was forgotten beneath the soil? For centuries, the Indus Valley civilization flourished with remarkable order. Its cities stretched across hundreds of miles. Its artisans traded goods as far as Mesopotamia, and its farmers tilled fertile fields in harmony with the rivers. Yet by around 1900 BC, the story began to change. Gradually, the great cities emptied, their drains clogged, their streets abandoned. The uniformity that had defined the civilization gave way to regional variation. By 1500 BC, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro lay in decline, and their script and traditions faded into silence. Why such an advanced society vanished remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. Archaeologists have pieced together possible causes, though no single explanation tells the whole story. One theory points to the shifting course of rivers. The Saraswati, or Ghaggar-Hakra, once a mighty waterway, appears to have dried or changed course. If true, settlements dependent on its floods would have been forced to relocate. Crops withered, fields cracked, and villages once sustained by fertile soil were abandoned. The Indus itself may have flooded unpredictably, destroying fields and silting canals. Water, which had sustained the civilization, may also have undone it. Another factor may have been climate change. Studies of pollen and sediment suggest the region grew drier around 2000 BC. Monsoon rains weakened, harvests shrank, and famine followed. Without surplus grain, the cities could no longer feed their populations. Communities dispersed into smaller rural settlements, abandoning the careful order of urban life for the flexibility of village survival. Some suggest internal decline played a role. The very complexity that had held the cities together may have faltered. Without strong rulers or armies, the Indus was vulnerable to disruption. As trade networks shifted and resources dwindled, the careful balance collapsed. Merchants lost their markets, artisans lost their patrons, and cities lost their purpose. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where rulers could demand tribute and labor, the Indus system may have depended on cooperation that dissolved when crisis struck. There is also the question of invasion. 19th century scholars once believed that Indo-Aryan migrants swept into the Indus Valley around 1500 BCE, toppling its cities. But modern evidence suggests a slower, more complex process. There are no signs of widespread war or destruction. Instead, it seems more likely that newcomers arrive gradually, mixing with remnants of Indus populations, blending cultures, and shaping what would become Vedic India. The end, then, was not violent conquest, but quiet absorption. What makes the mystery greater is the silence of the Indus script. Unlike Mesopotamia's cuneiform or Egypt's hieroglyphs, the writing of the Indus has never been deciphered. Thousands of seals remain, each marked with tiny symbols, but none long enough to tell us stories or laws. Without their words, we do not know how they explained their own decline. Did they pray for rains that never came? Did councils argue over dwindling harvests? Did families leave their brick houses with promises to return, only to find the rivers gone? Their voices remain locked in undeciphered marks, leaving us to guess. Yet even as the cities fell silent, life did not vanish entirely. The people of the Indus did not disappear. They adapted. Villages continued, smaller and simpler, but still tied to the land. Farming persisted with new crops like millet and rice. Traditions of worship carried forward, perhaps transforming into later South Asian beliefs. Some scholars see echoes of Indus symbols in later Hindu practices. The sacred pipal tree, the reverence for animals, and the focus on water and ritual bathing. Fragments of the old world may have flowed quietly into new ones, absorbed but not erased. To walk the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro today is to sense both greatness and fragility. The wide streets are still visible, and the outlines of houses are still clear. Wells punctuate courtyards, drains run beneath lanes, and staircases climb toward vanished roofs. One can almost imagine a merchant pressing a seal into clay, a woman grinding grain in her courtyard, and a child tugging a toy cart along the street. Yet the silence is overwhelming. No crowds fill the markets, no smoke rises from hearths, and no chants echo from ritual baths. The city lies exposed to sun and wind, its bricks crumbling under centuries of dust. Harappa tells a similar story, once a bustling hub of farmers, artisans, and traders. Today it is a mound of broken bricks. The granaries where grain was once stored are roofless. Shells, streets that once echoed with footsteps are buried in earth. What was once a civilization of millions survives only as fragments for archaeologists to uncover, piece by piece, like shards of pottery. And so, the Indus Valley civilization remains both known and unknown, known for its bricks, drains, and seals, which speak of remarkable order and quiet sophistication, unknown in its script, its rulers, its beliefs, and its final fate. It is perhaps this silence that makes it haunting. We can reconstruct their houses, their jewelry, and even their diets, but we cannot hear their stories, their names, their songs, their prayers, and their struggles are gone. In this silence lies the lesson of the Indus. Civilizations do not always fall with a crash. Sometimes they fade slowly, quietly, leaving behind not broken monuments of war, but the traces of ordinary life, bricks fired in kilns, beads drilled by hand, drains dug by planters, and toys once clutched by children. What lingers is not conquest, but community. Not kings, but people. And so we close the story of the Indus Valley with a question. Is its disappearance a warning of how fragile order can be? Or is it a reminder that even when great cities vanish, the threads of culture carry on quietly in new forms? Perhaps the true legacy of the Indus is not its silence, but the way its unseen influence still ripples through the history of South Asia, hidden in traditions, practices, and ways of life that endure long after the bricks of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro have crumbled into dust. In the warm seas of Southeast Asia, where the waters of the Indian Ocean meet the Pacific, there once thrived a maritime empire whose name is almost forgotten. It left behind no towering pyramids or sprawling cities of stone. Its power was not in armies marching across fields. but in ships gliding over waves, carrying spices, gold, and stories between worlds. This was the Srivijaya Empire, a realm that from the 7th to the 13th century commanded the straits and islands of what is now Indonesia and Malaysia, shaping the flow of trade across half the globe. Though Americans today rarely hear its name, Srivijaya was once a keystone of world commerce, a bridge between India, China, and the Middle East. The geography of Srivijaya was unlike that of land empires. It had no single capital city of stone, but rather a cluster of ports, islands, and river mouths linked by sea. Its heart lay at Palembang on the island of Sumatra, at the mouth of the Musi River. From here, ships could sail inland to gather pepper, resin, and camphor from tropical forests, or sail outward into the Malacca and Sunda Straits, the narrow channels that controlled passage between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Whoever controlled these straits could control the arteries of trade, and Srivijaya made this its strength. To imagine Palembang at its height is to picture a city floating partly on water. Houses stood on wooden stilts, lining the river banks, their thatched roofs shaded by palms. Markets spread across jetties, where merchants displayed baskets of spices, bundles of cloth, and jars of oil. The air smelled of fish drying in the sun and incense burning in shrines. The river was crowded with boats, dugout canoes, broad trading vessels, and Chinese junks heavy with cargo. Sailors called out in many languages: Malay, Tamil, Sanskrit, Arabic, and Chinese. The empire was not a land of fortresses, but a meeting place of seas and tongues. The daily life of Srivijaya's people revolved around both land and water. Farmers cultivated rice and paddies carved into valleys, their feet sinking into wet soil as they planted seedlings by hand. Coconut palms lined the coasts, giving fruit, oil, and fiber. Fishermen cast nets into estuaries and paddled dugouts into the sea, returning with fish, shrimp, and shellfish. Forest gatherers cut camphor, collected resin, and trapped birds for their feathers. Women wove mats and cloth from palm fiber, tended gardens of bananas and yams, and cooked rice with fish stews flavored by tamarind and spices. Life was humid, fragrant, and tied to the rhythm of tides and monsoons. What set Srivijaya apart was not its agriculture, but its mastery of trade. Its rulers understood that geography was wealth. The Malacca Strait was the narrowest channel between China and India, and every ship seeking silk, spices, or porcelain had to pass through. Srivijaya established itself as a guardian of these routes. Its fleets patrolled the waters, offering protection to merchants who paid tribute and threatening those who resisted. Ports collected taxes on cargo, filling royal coffers with revenue. In return, Srivijaya became a safe haven. Ships could dock for repairs, buy fresh water and food, and worship at shrines before continuing their voyages. Religion also played a key role in Srivijaya's identity. The empire became a center of Mahayana Buddhism, with monasteries and scholars attracting pilgrims from across Asia. Monks traveled from China to study in its monasteries before journeying onward to India. Palembang was described in Chinese records as a great hub of learning, where sutras were copied and teachers lectured beneath wooden pavilions. Pilgrims who stepped off ships found not only markets, but also prayer halls filled with chanting, incense, and statues of the Buddha. Religion blended with trade, giving Srivijaya both material and spiritual power. For villagers and townsfolk, life was shaped less by kings and more by tides. The monarchy, the real, was distant, its authority expressed through taxes collected in markets and rituals performed at courts. People in stilt houses thought more of weather than politics. The arrival of the southwest monsoon bringing ships from India, the northeast monsoon carrying junks from China, and the storms that could sink both. Merchants timed journeys by winds, while families prayed for gentle seas and plentiful harvests. Ships were the heartbeat of Srivijaya. Local sailors built vessels from planks lashed with fiber ropes, their hulls sealed with resin. Outriggers stabilized smaller craft, while larger ships carried tons of cargo across oceans. Crews slept under woven mats, steering by stars and monsoon winds. Cargo holds brimmed with pepper, nutmeg, sandalwood, ivory, and gold, bound for China or the Middle East. In return came Chinese porcelain, Indian cotton cloth, Persian glass, and Arabian incense. Every journey was a gamble, but fortunes were made with each safe return. Unlike kingdoms defined by armies and borders, Srivijaya was defined by networks. Its empire was fluid, stretching wherever its fleets and influence reached. Some islands paid tribute willingly, others were coerced. Its rulers bore titles in Sanskrit, drawing on Indian traditions of kingship, but their power lay less in force and more in commerce. To rule Srivijaya was to sit at the crossroads of the world, listening to the languages of sailors and counting the goods of merchants. Yet this maritime strength also gave the empire a fragility that land empires did not face. A bad season of monsoons could disrupt trade, and a rival fleet could seize the straits. Villagers far inland in Sumatra or Java may have thought little of who claimed the throne, for their rice and coconuts fed them regardless. The empire's greatness was tied not to soil but to sea, and seas are ever shifting. Still, in its prime, Srivijaya was a name known from Arabia to China. To Mesopotamian merchants, its spices were luxury. To Chinese envoys, its ports were gateways. To Indian monks, its monasteries were sanctuaries. To its own people, it was simply home a network of rivers, markets, and ships where life was measured not in battles but in journeys across the waves. And so we pause with a question. Can an empire built on water and wind, without walls or monuments, leave a legacy strong enough to survive the centuries? Or must its memory vanish with the tides it once commanded? At its height, Srivijaya was more than an empire of ports and ships. It was a hinge of worlds, a place where traders, pilgrims, and sailors paused between great voyages. From the 8th to the 11th century, it flourished as the hub of the spice trade and as one of the most important Buddhist centers in Asia. Chinese dynasties, Indian kingdoms, and Arab merchants all knew its name, and yet today it is a shadow in history, remembered mostly by scholars and faint ruins along riversides. The wealth of Srivijaya came above all from spices. In the forests of Sumatra and the neighboring islands grew cloves, nutmeg, and camphor, treasures worth their weight in gold to foreign buyers. Pepper vines curled up trees, their fruits dried in the sun until they could be packed into sacks. Resin and camphor were gathered from trees and sold for incense, medicine, and perfume. To people living along the rivers, these were simply parts of the landscape, gathered by hand and brought to markets. But once they passed into the holds of ships, they became luxuries sought in China, India, and the Middle East. A sack of nutmeg might travel thousands of miles, exchanged again and again, until it ended in a royal palace in Baghdad or a scholar's study in Chang'an. Trade was not only in goods, but also in ideas. Buddhism in particular flourished under Srivijaya's patronage. Monasteries rose near Palembang, their pavilions built of wood and stone, decorated with carvings of lotuses and serene Buddhas. Monks copied sutras onto palm leaves, their ink letters preserving sacred texts. Pilgrims from China made long voyages to Srivijaya to study before traveling on to India. One of the most famous, the Chinese monk Yijing, stayed there for months in the 7th century, praising its monasteries and the devotion of its rulers. He wrote that hundreds of monks lived and studied in Srivijaya, practicing meditation and debate, making the empire not only a commercial crossroads but also a spiritual one. In towns along the rivers, daily life reflected this blend of trade and faith. Markets sold rice, coconuts, dried fish, and woven mats alongside sacks of pepper and beads of glass. In the mornings, fishermen pushed boats into estuaries, their nets glistening with fish and shrimp. Women carried baskets of bananas and yams to market stalls, while children wove through the crowd. Merchants from India displayed cotton cloth dyed in bright colors, while Chinese traders offered porcelain bowls that gleamed with smooth glaze. Amidst the noise, monks walked barefoot with begging bowls, receiving offerings of rice and fruit, While chanting prayers in quiet corners, life moved at the pace of both the market and the monastery, a balance of material and spiritual. The ships of Srivijaya were its lifeblood. Local shipbuilders crafted vessels with broad hulls, lashed with rattan and sealed with resin, capable of carrying tons of cargo. Sails were made of woven palm leaves, and outriggers steadied smaller boats. These ships could cross the Indian Ocean or sail north to China, following the monsoon winds. Crews often included a mix of peoples: Malays, Indians, Arabs, and even Chinese sailors worked together, guided by stars and the knowledge of currents. For months at sea, life was cramped and risky. Food was rice and dried fish, water stored in jars, and nights spent under mats spread across the deck. Yet the promise of wealth made the danger worthwhile, and each safe arrival at port brought relief and celebration. Srivijaya's rulers understood that power depended on controlling the straits. They built networks of alliances, requiring tribute from smaller islands and kingdoms. Tribute could be paid in spices, forest products, or even slaves captured in raids. In return, Srivijaya offered protection to traders and maintained order in the seas. The empire's fleets could be swift and fierce when needed, raiding rivals or punishing defiance. But for most of its history, its strength came not from violence, but from ensuring the smooth flow of commerce. For the common people, the monarchy was distant. Kings ruled from palaces in Palembang, surrounded by courtiers, priests, and envoys. But villagers and townsfolk were more concerned with planting rice, fishing rivers, or gathering forest products. Taxes were collected in goods, not coins. A farmer might give part of his rice harvest, a fisherman part of his catch, or a forest dweller resin or camphor. These offerings moved up the chain, sustaining officials, priests, and eventually the king's household. In return, festivals and rituals were held in which the ruler was praised as a protector and blessed by Buddhist monks. The monarchy was both practical and sacred, grounded in trade but legitimized by religion. Life on the islands under Srivijaya was shaped by the sea. Villages were built on stilts along riverbanks, safe from floods. Boats were tied to wooden piers, always ready to move. The rhythm of life followed the monsoon. In one season, winds carried ships westward to India. In another, they carried ships eastward to China. Families timed planting and harvesting with these winds, for they knew the traders would arrive when the monsoon shifted, even in remote places. The influence of distant worlds was felt, as cloth from India or bowls from China appeared in local homes. Srivijaya's Buddhist learning centers gave it prestige beyond trade. Monks came from Java, Cambodia, and even Korea to study in its monasteries. The chanting of sutras echoed in wooden halls, incense rose into humid air, and sacred texts were copied and preserved. For some, Srivijaya was a stepping stone on the pilgrimage to India, but for others it was a place of deep study in its own right. Its kings were remembered as patrons of Buddhism, giving land to monasteries and sponsoring scholars. The fusion of commerce and religion made the empire unique. Its ports were both markets and sanctuaries, and its rulers were both traders and patrons of faith. At its height, Srivijaya seemed stable, yet its strength carried the seeds of fragility. Its wealth depended on trade, and trade depended on winds, seas, and distant markets. A single shift in routes or fortunes could weaken it. For centuries, though, it held the balance. From Palembang, rulers looked out over rivers crowded with boats, markets full of foreign voices, and monasteries filled with chanting. For villagers, it was simply life. Rice planted in paddies, fish caught from nets, pepper dried in the sun, and prayers offered for safe winds. For merchants, it was an opportunity, a safe harbor in dangerous seas. For monks, it was a sanctuary, a place where wisdom and scripture thrived. And so we pause with a question: can an empire built on currents of wind and tides, holding together so many peoples and faiths, maintain its power forever? Or must even the strongest crossroads eventually give way to shifting routes and new rivals? For centuries, Srivijaya had been the master of the seas, the keeper of the straits, and the guardian of trade between east and west. Its ships had carried spices across oceans. Its monasteries had trained monks from across Asia, and its rulers had balanced the needs of merchants and pilgrims alike. Yet by the 11th and 12th centuries, the tide began to turn. Like many empires built on fragile networks, Srivijaya's strength depended on winds, markets, and alliances, and when these shifted, its power ebbed away. The first blows came not from distant lands, but from neighbors who envied its position. The Javanese kingdom of Mataram and later Kadiri rose in the islands of the east, challenging Srivijaya for dominance in maritime trade. From the west, the powerful Chola dynasty of southern India launched daring naval raids. In 1025, the Chola king Rajendra I sent fleets across the Bay of Bengal, striking directly at Srivijaya's ports. Palembang was attacked, and for a time, Srivijaya's control of the straits was broken, though the empire recovered. Partially, the raids revealed its vulnerability. A realm without walls and fortresses, dependent on ships and tides, could be shaken by a single foreign fleet. At the same time, the flow of trade itself began to change. Chinese dynasties that had once relied on middlemen grew more interested in direct trade. Arab merchants, too, began sailing deeper into Asian waters, bypassing older hubs. The routes that had once made Palembang indispensable now began to spread across a wider map, diminishing its unique hold on commerce. The very openness that had made Srivijaya a crossroads now made it easy for rivals to siphon away traffic. For ordinary people, the decline of Srivijaya came gradually. Fishermen still cast nets into rivers, farmers still planted rice and paddies, and forest gatherers still cut resin and pepper vines. Yet the markets grew quieter. Fewer foreign ships anchored at piers, fewer merchants filled stalls with bright cloth or porcelain. Taxes became heavier as rulers tried to make up for lost trade. Conflicts with rival kingdoms disrupted shipping, and piracy grew along the straits. Families who once watched the river crowded with sails now saw empty waters or raiding fleets. Religion, too, began to shift. Srivijaya had been a center of Mahayana Buddhism, but as its power waned, influence moved to other places. Java developed its own monuments, like Borobudur, that drew pilgrims. Theravada Buddhism spread more strongly in mainland Southeast Asia. Srivijaya's monasteries continued for a time, but the streams of students and pilgrims slowed. The chanting in halls grew thinner, the copying of manuscripts less frequent, and the empire's role as a spiritual beacon dimmed, alongside its political one. By the 13th century, new powers rose to take its place. On the Malay Peninsula, smaller port kingdoms asserted independence. In Java, new dynasties expanded their reach. By the 14th century, the Majapahit Empire emerged, commanding much of the region that Srivijaya had once controlled. Palembang, once the bustling capital of an empire, became just one city among many, its former glory fading into memory. The final decline was quiet, not sudden. There was no single battle that ended Srivijaya, no grand conquest that toppled its throne. Instead, it dissolved into smaller fragments, its authority eroded by rivals, trade shifts, and internal weakness. Villages continued. Boats still plied rivers, and markets still exchanged rice and fish. But the name Srivijaya no longer commanded seas. The empire had depended on tides, and tides, by nature, turn. Centuries later, even as memory nearly disappeared. Unlike the stone monuments of Angkor or Borobudur, Srivijaya left few lasting ruins. Wooden houses rotted away, ships sank beneath the sea, and river banks swallowed palaces. For generations, knowledge of the empire survived only in scattered inscriptions, Chinese records, and faint local legends. It was not until the 20th century that archaeologists pieced together its story, uncovering inscriptions in Sanskrit and Chinese texts that described a once great maritime power. What had seemed like a forgotten name became, slowly, a rediscovered empire. And yet, even in its absence, Srivijaya left traces that shaped the region. The Malay language, influenced by centuries of trade and diplomacy, carried words that spread across Southeast Asia. Local traditions of kingship drew on its legacy of combining commerce with sacred patronage. Ports that had once been under its rule remained important long after its fall, forming the backbone of later trade routes. Even the pattern of monsoon-based sailing, carefully nurtured by Srivijaya's merchants, continued to guide commerce for centuries. To imagine the end of Srivijaya is to picture a river city slowly emptying. Boats no longer crowd. The piers, markets grow quiet. Monasteries close their doors. Families still plant rice, still mend nets, still cook fish stews flavored with tamarind. But the voices of farm merchants no longer echo in their streets. A place that was once the meeting point of the world fades back into being only a local town, its greatness hidden beneath layers of time and silt. The story of Srivijaya is a reminder that not all empires are built of stone. Some are built of water, wind, and trust. Their strength lies not in fortresses but in relationships, not in armies but in networks. They are powerful while currents flow their way, but fragile when currents shift. Srivijaya held the straits for centuries, long enough to shape trade and belief across Asia, but not long enough to etch itself deeply into memory like Rome or Egypt. Its legacy is quiet, like the tides that once carried its ships. And so we end with a thought. Perhaps Srivijaya's greatness is not in its ruins, which barely survive, but in its role as a bridge between India and China, between faith and commerce, between land and sea. Perhaps its disappearance is not failure, but the natural ebb of a maritime world where nothing is fixed, only flowing. And perhaps the true question is this: when an empire leaves so little behind, is it gone? Or does it live on in every spice, every word, and every tradition that once passed through its ports and still lingers today? At the height of the Khmer Empire, Angkor stood as one of the largest cities on earth, a place of stone towers, vast reservoirs, and endless rice fields. From the 11th to the 13th century, it was the center of power in mainland Southeast Asia, drawing artisans, priests, farmers, and traders into a web of life sustained by water and commanded by kings. To walk its streets during this time would have been to feel both awe and order. A city where every canal and temple proclaimed the might of rulers who saw themselves as linked to gods. The city of Angkor was more than temples. Surrounding Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, and countless other shrines stretched suburbs, markets, and villages. Wooden houses stood on stilts along canals, each with ladders leading to shaded porches where families ate rice and fish by lamplight. Wells dotted neighborhoods, while ponds shimmered with lotus flowers. Streets bustled with vendors selling vegetables, dried fish, sugar from palm trees, and cloth woven on household looms. Elephants moved through markets, hauling timber or stone for construction, their handlers guiding them with quiet commands. Carts drawn by oxen rumbled along roads, carrying rice to storehouses or stone blocks to temple sites. At the heart of this world stood monumental temples. Angkor Wat, built in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman II, rose as the crown jewel of Khmer architecture. Its towers, shaped like lotus buds, climbed toward the sky, surrounded by moats and galleries. Carvings along its walls stretched for miles, depicting gods, battles, and celestial dancers. In the cool darkness of its corridors, pilgrims walked barefoot, offering flowers and incense at shrines. To build such a monument required decades of labor, the work of thousands who quarried stone, dragged it by elephant and raft, carved it with chisels, and stacked it with precision. The scale of this effort was itself a declaration of power. A king who could command such labor was no ordinary man, but one whose authority touched the divine. Angkor Thom, the great city built later by Jayavarman VII, added yet another marvel. Its towers bore faces carved in stone, serene and smiling, gazing in every direction. To walk through its gates was to feel watched by the gods themselves, or perhaps by the king who wished to be remembered as their earthly reflection. Inside, monasteries, palaces, and markets mingled with ponds and gardens woven into the city's plan. The sheer number of temples and shrines gave Angkor a skyline of stone, rising from the jungle like a city built to honor both heaven and earth. Yet behind this grandeur was the unseen system that sustained it all: water. The Khmer mastery of hydraulic engineering was unmatched. Reservoirs, or bays, stretched for miles, their surfaces glistening under the sun. Canals carried water to paddies, ensuring harvest even in dry seasons. Moats surrounded temples, reflecting towers in shimmering water. This system allowed Angkor to feed a population larger than many European kingdoms of the same era. It was a city of farmers as much as builders, its foundations set not only in stone, but in rice. Daily life in Angkor was defined by this abundance. Farmers worked in groups, wading into flooded fields to plant seedlings, their feet sinking into mud. Children played along dikes, catching fish or chasing frogs. Women spun silk, weaving cloth dyed in saffron, indigo, or green, some of which clothed monks and nobles. Artisans carved statues, made pottery, and forged bronze bells for temples. Markets were lively, filled with barter and exchange: rice for salt, fish for cloth, herbs for palm sugar, spices, rare forest products, and even ivory found their way to merchants who carried them further afield. Linking Angkor to distant trade routes, religion infused every part of life. Monks in saffron robes walked barefoot through streets, their begging bowls filled by villagers with rice and fruit. Priests performed ceremonies in temples, offering flowers, lamps, and chants to Hindu gods and Buddhist images alike. Dancers trained from youth performed at court, their movements precise and fluid, their hands curling like lotus petals. These dancers were more than entertainers. They were living symbols of divine beauty, embodying the apsaras carved on temple walls. Festivals brought entire communities together, with processions, music, and offerings that filled the city with color and sound. For villagers, religion offered comfort and guidance. For kings, it was a tool to legitimize their rule. Kingship in the Khmer Empire was more than politics. It was cosmic order. Kings were seen as Devaraja, or god kings, their authority tied to divine presence. Temples served as both places of worship and monuments to this ideology. A king who built a reservoir and a temple was not only feeding his people, but also sustaining the balance between gods and humans. In this sense, every stone tower and every canal was part of a sacred landscape, linking heaven and earth, king and cosmos. The empire was not without hardship. Labor for temples and reservoirs was heavy, demanded of villagers through corvée service. Men and women might spend months hauling stone or digging canals far from their homes. Taxes were exacted in rice, labor, or goods, sustaining the court and the priesthood. Diseases spread in dense settlements, and droughts or floods could disrupt harvest despite the canals. Yet the system endured for centuries, suggesting that most found stability within it, even if at times burdensome. To stand in Angkor at its peak would have been to see contrasts. In one moment, the solemn processions of monks chanting prayers beneath stone towers. In another, the noise of markets alive with barter. In yet another, the sweat of workers cutting stone in quarries or bending in rice paddies. The city was both sacred and practical, a place of gods and farmers, kings and commoners, temples and canals. Angkor's influence reached beyond Cambodia. Its kings sent envoys and armies to neighboring lands, extending influence into present-day Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Tribute flowed in, not only in goods, but also in symbolic gestures of respect. Angkor was a capital that radiated power across the region, a city whose name carried weight on both battlefield and temple floor. Yet even in this peak, fragility lingered. A system so dependent on water and rice required constant maintenance. A king's authority relied on successful harvests and monumental projects. A drought, a failed crop, or a weak ruler could threaten balance. For the moment, though, Angkor flourished. Its reservoirs full, its temples gleaming, its people sustained by a sense of order that seemed eternal. And so we pause with a question. Can any city, no matter how well planned, how abundant, and how sacred, truly endure forever? Or is even the mightiest temple city destined one day to crumble beneath the jungle that waits patiently beyond its walls? By the 14th century, Angkor still stood as a monumental city of temples and canals. But the balance that had sustained it for centuries was beginning to falter. The reservoirs that once gleamed, with stored water silted up, canals cracked under neglect, monsoons shifted, and droughts followed by sudden floods struck the land. What had once been Angkor's greatest strength, its mastery of water, slowly turned into its vulnerability. Without the constant rhythm of rice harvests, the city that had supported hundreds of thousands of people began to weaken. The decline was not immediate or dramatic, but gradual, spread across generations. Farmers who once produced surplus rice struggled when canals failed to deliver water. Harvests fell short, markets thinned, and the grand building projects that had defined Khmer kingship slowed. The massive labor force that had once built temples and berets was no longer sustainable. Without steady food, the great city strained under its own weight. At the same time, new powers rose around Angkor. To the west, the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya grew stronger, pressing against Khmer territories. Armies raided, borders shifted, and Angkor, once the conqueror, found itself on the defensive. To the east, Vietnamese kingdoms pushed forward, further tightening pressure on Khmer lands. Angkor's influence, once stretching far across Southeast Asia, contracted to its heartland. Religion, too, shifted in ways that reflected deeper change. For centuries, Angkor had been defined by the monumental stone temples dedicated to Hindu gods and Mahayana Buddhist ideals. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, Theravada Buddhism spread more widely among common people. This was a faith less tied to kings and monuments, and more to individual practice, village monasteries, and small offerings. Monks in simple robes taught humility, meditation, and the search for inner peace. For farmers and villagers weary of corvée labor and heavy taxes, this message held appeal. Gradually, the vision of the God King, linked to towering temples and massive reservoirs, gave way to a quieter, simpler religiosity. As faith shifted, the king's divine image weakened. Life for ordinary villagers continued in many ways as it always had. Families still planted rice, fished rivers, and cooked stews of fish and vegetables flavored with herbs. Children still played along canals, and artisans still spun silk and fired pottery. Yet the scale of grandeur diminished. Fewer foreign traders visited Angkor, as maritime routes increasingly favored coastal ports in Ayutthaya and beyond. Villages became more self-sufficient, less tied to the bustling cosmopolitan networks that had once made Angkor a world city. The forests, ever patient, began to reclaim what man had built. As canals clogged and dikes collapsed, water spilled unpredictably, leaving pools that bred disease or drying paddies that once yielded abundance. Wooden houses rotted and vanished within years of abandonment. Even stone temples, mighty as they were, cracked under the roots of banyan and strangler figs. Vines crept across galleries, and monkeys swung through towers once filled with incense and chants. The jungle did not conquer Angkor in a single moment, but swallowed it slowly, season by season, century by century. By the 15th century, the capital itself was abandoned. Chronicles suggest that Ayutthaya's armies attacked, forcing the Khmer court to retreat southward to Phnom Penh. Whether through conquest or collapse, Angkor was left behind. Its temples remained, silent but immense, but its streets emptied. Villagers stayed in scattered hamlets, but the great reservoirs, canals, and markets were no longer maintained. The city that had been one of the largest in the world became a ruin, its stones standing lonely against the jungle's green tide. For centuries afterward, Angkor lingered in memory, but not in prominence. Local people still visited its temples, still offered prayers at its shrines, but the city no longer commanded an empire. Travelers who passed through marveled at the ruins but found little explanation for their builders. By the time Europeans stumbled upon Angkor in the 19th century, it appeared to them as a lost city, an abandoned marvel swallowed by forest. They could not imagine that it had once been the thriving center of a great empire, sustained not by myth but by rice, water, and human labor. The story of Angkor's fall is not a story of a single event, but of a long unraveling. Droughts weakened it, floods damaged it, invasions pressed it, and shifting trade routes bypassed it. Its faith transformed, its rulers lost their divine aura, and its water system, the intricate heart of the empire, failed. In the end, Angkor was not destroyed, but outgrown, replaced by new centers, new powers, and new ways of life. Its people adapted, moving closer to rivers that flowed more reliably, building smaller towns that fit the changing age. To stand in Angkor today is to feel the contrast. The towers of Angkor Wat still rise into the sky, their walls carved with epic stories of gods and battles. The smiling faces of bands still gaze across courtyards, yet silence fills their halls. The jungle hums with insects, roots split stone, and tourists walk where once kings held processions. What was once alive with music, prayer, and labor is now a reminder of how even the greatest cities can fade. The Khmer Empire left more behind than ruins. Its influence shaped Cambodia's culture, religion, and identity. Its language, art, and traditions echo in the region today. Its engineering feats remain unmatched in their scale, testimony to the ability of human hands to bend water and stone into order. And its fall offers a lesson that greatness is fragile, dependent on balance between nature, faith, and human effort. And so we end with a reflection. The Khmer Empire conquered the jungle, harnessed water, and carved heaven into stone. For centuries, it seemed eternal, a city of gods and kings. Yet eventually it was humbled, its monuments left to roots and rain. Perhaps its true legacy is not only in the ruins that remain, but in the reminder that all human grandeur, no matter how solid it seems, is as fragile as the balance of rain and river that once sustained it. In the humid jungles of Cambodia, where banyan roots twist over stones and parrots call through the thick canopy, lie the remains of one of Asia's greatest empires. Towering temples rise from the forest, carved with dancers, gods, and warriors, their stones blackened by centuries of rain. Today, these ruins are known as Angkor, and tourists marvel at their size and mystery. But centuries ago, this was no ruin. It was the beating heart of the Khmer Empire, a realm that between the 9th and 15th centuries commanded much of mainland Southeast Asia. Unlike Srivijaya, which thrived on water and ships, the Khmer Empire thrived on land, rice fields, and monumental stone. Its legacy is not in vanished ports, but in temples that still pierce the jungle's sky. The Khmer homeland was the floodplain of the Mekong River, a broad expanse of fertile soil shaped by monsoons. Each year, rain swelled the Mekong and its tributaries, flooding fields and replenishing lakes. At the heart of this system was the Tonle Sap, a great lake whose waters rose and fell with the seasons, expanding in monsoon months and shrinking in the dry. This cycle gave the Khmer their wealth. Rice fields spread across the floodplain, producing 2 or even 3 harvests a year. Villages clustered along canals, their houses built on stilts to survive floods. Farmers worked barefoot in the paddies, planting seedlings in straight rows, while buffalo dragged wooden plows through the mud. In this landscape, food abundance and abundance was power. From this base, Khmer rulers built an empire starting in the 9th century. Kings established their capitals near the Tonle Sap, constructing cities that combined palaces, reservoirs, and temples. The most famous was Angkor, a city that at its height may have held hundreds of thousands of people, making it one of the largest urban centers in the world. Unlike the wooden houses of villagers, which vanished over time, the temples were built of sandstone and laterite, their carvings still visible today. These were not only places of worship, but also statements of authority. To build Angkor Wat or Bayon was to proclaim that the king ruled not just men, but also the gods. that his authority extended to heaven and earth. Daily life in the Khmer Empire, however, was not lived in temples but in villages. Most people were farmers, bound to rice cycles. At dawn, families carried seedlings into the paddies, bending in rhythm as they planted rows. Women weeded fields, men repaired dikes and canals, and children chased fish in flooded paddies. Houses of wood and palm leaves stood on stilts, reached by ladders, their rooms simple but functional. Meals were rice, fish, and vegetables, flavored with herbs and sauces. Poundsugar sweetened dishes, and fermented fish paste gave them salt. In the evenings, families sat under oil lamps, listening to elders tell stories of gods and ancestors. Artisans added richness to this life. Potters shaped clay jars for storing rice and water. Blacksmiths forged tools, knives, and spearheads. Weavers spun silk and cotton, dyeing cloth in bright colors. Dancers and musicians entertained courts and villages alike, their movements echoing the graceful carvings on temple walls. Traders carried surplus rice, cloth, and forest products to markets where they were exchanged for salt, metals, and luxury goods. Elephants, captured from forests, served as beasts of burden and symbols of power, carrying timber, stone, and soldiers when needed. Religion bound the Khmer world together. At first, rulers drew on Hindu traditions from India, worshipping Shiva and Vishnu, carving their images into temples and associating themselves with gods through rituals. The mountain temples symbolized Mount Meru, the cosmic axis of Hindu belief, while reservoirs symbolized the oceans. Later, Buddhism, particularly Mahayana and eventually Theravada, spread across the land. Temples filled with statues of the Buddha alongside Hindu gods, and rituals blended. Priests performed ceremonies for kings, monks taught in villages, and villagers offered rice and flowers at shrines. For common people, faith was practical, tied to fertility, harvest, and protection from misfortune. For rulers, it was political, legitimizing their rule as divine. The scale of Khmer engineering was astonishing. To feed cities and temples, rulers built vast reservoirs, or barrages, covering miles of land. These collected monsoon rains fed canals that irrigated fields even in dry seasons. Angkor's system of water management was perhaps the most sophisticated of the medieval world. Canals stretched across the plain, carrying water to paddies and filling moats around temples. The very survival of Angkor depended on this mastery of water, for it allowed hundreds of thousands of people to live in one place, sustained by endless rice. At the center of this system stood the kings. They were more than rulers. They were god kings, linked to deities through ritual. Coronations involved elaborate ceremonies where Brahmin priests invoked gods, and offerings were made to ensure cosmic balance. The building of temples was itself a sacred act. To carve stone into towers shaped like lotus buds, to inscribe walls with stories of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, was to connect earth with heaven. The labor of thousands of workers, artisans, and slaves poured into these monuments, leaving behind the silent towers that still rise above the jungle. Yet behind this grandeur was the quiet life of villagers, whose labor made everything possible. Each brick of a temple was shaped by hands that likely lived in wood nuts. Each grain of rice that fed workers was planted by farmers bent over flooded fields. The empire's glory rested on their toil, though their names were never inscribed on walls. For them, the empire was distant, felt through taxes, corvée labor, and occasional festivals when the king's processions passed by. Their world was local, paddies, canals, families, and shrines. To stand in Angkor today is to feel both majesty and silence. Towers rise like stone mountains, their carvings of Apsara dancers still delicate, their corridors echoing with birds instead of worshippers. Roots of banyan trees split walls, and pools reflect broken towers. But to imagine the city alive is to hear the chants of monks, the clang of smiths, the laughter of children splashing in canals, and the steady rhythm of farmers' footsteps in fields. And so, The Khmer Empire emerged not only as a realm of kings and temples, but as a society of farmers, artisans, monks, and traders, bound together by rice, faith, and water. It was a civilization that turned jungle into city, flood into abundance, and stone into monuments that have outlasted centuries. And so we pause with a question. How could a society that commanded such engineering, faith, and abundance that carved its power into stone itself fall into ruin and be swallowed by the forest it once conquered? In the dry lands of northwestern China, where deserts meet mountains and rivers cut narrow paths through endless sand, there once stood a kingdom that few remember today. Its name was the Western Jia, or the Tangut Empire, a dynasty that thrived between the 11th and 13th centuries before vanishing almost completely under the fury of the Mongols. For 2 centuries, it held its ground between China, Tibet, and Central Asia, guarding the vital Silk Road routes that carried caravans of silk, horses, and spices across the desert. It left behind its own script, its own culture, and the ruins of its cities buried in sand yet for centuries after its fall. Even its name was almost erased from memory. The Tanguts, the people who founded Western Jia, were of Tibetan origin, a semi-nomadic people who herded sheep, goats, and horses on the steppes while also practicing settled agriculture. Their homeland lay along the Yellow River's Great Bend, where oases and irrigation allowed farming to flourish amid harsh landscapes to outsiders. Their land was a desert frontier, a place of dust storms and shifting sands. To the Tanguts, it was a home where sheep grazed in valleys. Farmers planted millet and wheat along rivers, and merchants guided camels laden with goods through dry passes. The Western Jia emerged in the 11th century as Tangut leaders consolidated power in these borderlands. They declared independence from the great Chinese Song dynasty to the east, asserting their authority in the frontier. Their rulers claimed the title of emperor, built walled cities, and developed their own writing system, a complex script designed to preserve their language and laws. To carve letters into wood and silk was to mark their presence against the weight of Chinese and Tibetan influence. This script, once widely used, was so intricate that later scholars struggled to decipher it, leaving the Tangut voice silent for centuries. Life in the Western Jia was shaped by both nomadic and settled traditions. Villages of farmers lined the irrigated bends of the Yellow River, where fields of millet, barley, and wheat grew under the hot sun. Families tended orchards of apricots and dates, while herds grazed in upland pastures. Houses were made of mud brick, built to withstand heat and dust, their courtyards shaded with awnings. In smaller hamlets, yurts and tents still stood beside farmhouses, reminders of nomadic roots. Horses were central to Tangut life, not only for war, but also for transport and trade. A Tangut noble was often judged by the strength and beauty of his horses, prized for speed across the desert. The cities of Western Jia reflected its dual nature. Ningxia, the capital, was fortified with high walls of rammed earth, punctuated with gates and watchtowers within its streets. Markets bustled with activity, caravans arriving from Central Asia, with spices and glassware, Chinese merchants selling silk and porcelain, and local traders offering wool, hides, and horses. Inns and tea houses lined the markets, where travelers rested before continuing across the desert. Temples rose alongside markets, their halls filled with Buddhist statues and Tangut inscriptions. The Tanguts embraced Buddhism deeply, building monasteries where monks copied scriptures and taught doctrine for pilgrims. Western Jia became a station along the spiritual as well as commercial road between India, Tibet, and China. The Tangut rulers styled themselves emperors equal to the Chinese, their court ceremonies rich with symbolism. They wore robes embroidered with dragons and sat on thrones beneath banners bearing Tangut script. Yet their empire was always one of balance and negotiation. To the east was the mighty Song dynasty, wealthy and powerful, whose silk and trade goods the Tanguts desired, but whose armies they could not match directly. To the north and west were nomadic tribes and rival states, some allies, some enemies, to survive. Western Jia balanced tribute, warfare, and diplomacy, trading horses to the Song in exchange for silk and negotiating with nomads for peace. Their empire was a frontier buffer, a middle ground where many worlds met. For ordinary Tangids, life was practical and demanding. Farmers worked long days in hot fields, irrigating crops through canals dug from the Yellow River. Herdsmen moved with seasons, grazing flocks in higher pastures during summer and returning to valleys in winter. Artisans made pottery, wove cloth, and forged tools of iron and bronze. Women often managed households and weaving, producing textiles for both domestic use and trade. Meals were simple, bread from millet or wheat, stews of lamb and vegetables, dairy products from goats, and dried fruits. Tea, imported from China, became a staple, drunk by nobles and commoners alike. Religion gave rhythm and meaning to Tangied life. Buddhism, especially Tibetan-influenced forms, shaped their art and architecture. Monasteries dotted the land, their walls painted with images of bodhisattvas, their halls echoing with chants. Monks walked through cities with begging bowls, receiving offerings of food. Families kept shrines in their homes, offering incense or food to deities. The Tangied rulers themselves were patrons of Buddhism, sponsoring temples and sutra translations into the Tangied script. Pilgrims passing along the Silk Road found sanctuary in Western Shia's temples, where prayers rose alongside the dust of caravans. And yet, despite this richness, Western Jia was always vulnerable. Its land was harsh, its resources limited, and its population smaller than those of its neighbors. Its strength came not from sheer power, but from control of routes and skillful diplomacy. It was a gatekeeper of the Silk Road, a custodian of trade and faith in a desert realm. For 2 centuries, this balance held, and the Tangids carved their place in history. Today, the ruins of Western Jia lie quiet under desert skies. Rammed earth walls crumble slowly into sand, their outlines barely visible against dunes. Broken Buddhist statues lie half buried, their features worn by wind. Inscriptions in the Tangied script remain, but for centuries no one could read them. It was as though the empire had vanished not only from the earth but also from memory itself. Only with modern scholarship have fragments of their voice returned. And so we pause with a question. How can a dynasty that built cities, created its own script, and held the Silk Road for centuries vanish so completely, leaving behind only silent ruins in the desert? At the height of its power in the 12th century, the Western Jia was a kingdom of contrasts. To outsiders, it was a desert realm fringed with mountains and oases, a land of dust storms and caravan trails. Yet within its borders stood flourishing cities, irrigated fields, monasteries filled with chanting monks, and markets where goods from 3 continents changed hands. It was an empire not built on lush valleys or endless populations, but on resilience and position, for it sat astride the Silk Road, the artery that tied China, Central Asia, India, and the Middle East together. The capital, Ningxia, was both a fortress and a market town. Its thick rammed earth walls rose high above the plains, square towers guarding its gates, signaling both defiance and welcome. Caravans approaching from the desert would first see the shimmer of its walls against the horizon, then the sprawl of houses, shops, and temples within. By day, the markets are filled with life. Merchants from the east brought silks, porcelain, and tea from the Song dynasty. From the west came spices, glassware, silver, and horses. Central Asian traders led camels loaded with wool and gems, while local Tangied farmers brought sacks of millet, baskets of apricots, and wheels of cheese made from goat's milk. Voices mixed in many tongues: Tangied, Chinese, Tibetan, Persian, and Arabic. The empire grew wealthy not because it produced great surpluses of its own, but because it taxed and guarded the flow of goods that passed through. Officials carefully weighed bales of silk and measured sacks of pepper, taking their portion as tolls. Inns and caravanserai provided lodging for travelers, their courtyards filled with camels and horses, their kitchens serving stews and tea to weary merchants. To walk through a Western Jia market at noon was to feel the pulse of a world in motion, a crossroads where distant lands met. But trade alone was not the empire's identity. Western Jia was also a center of Buddhist learning. Its rulers patronized monasteries and sponsored the translation of scriptures into the Tangut language, using the unique script they had devised. Monks studied not only Chinese sutras but also Tibetan teachings, creating a fusion of traditions that reflected their frontier position. In temples, walls were painted with intricate murals of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, their serene faces gazing out over rows of monks reciting chants. Pilgrims traveling the Silk Road often rested in these monasteries, offering prayers before continuing their long journeys. For ordinary people, life in Western Jia was demanding but steady. In villages along the Yellow River's Great Bend, farmers worked fields watered by canals that stretched across the arid land. These canals, dug with communal labor, turned desert into farmland, sustaining wheat, millet, and barley. In summer, men and women bent over rows of crops, while children fetched water from ditches and tended goats. In autumn, families harvested grain, dried it in courtyards, and stored it in clay jars to survive winter. Herding remained just as vital. Nomadic families grazed flocks in higher pastures, their yurts dotting the plains, moving with the seasons as their ancestors had. Horses were prized above all. A good horse could decide the outcome of a raid or a caravan journey, and Tangut horses were famous for their endurance. In towns, artisans gave shape to the empire's wealth. Potters produced both simple household wares and glazed vessels admired by traders. Weavers created cloth of wool, silk, and cotton, dyed in bright colors and often embroidered with patterns of animals or flowers. Metalworkers forged plows, knives, and weapons. Calligraphers carefully brushed Tangut script onto wood and silk, recording laws, poetry, and religious texts. Though their script was complex, it became a symbol of identity, a way to declare that the Tanguts were neither Chinese nor Tibetan, but their own people, with their own voice. Society was structured but flexible. At the top stood the emperor and noble families, who held estates and commanded troops. Below them were officials who managed cities, collected taxes, and supervised trade. Buddhist clergy held prestige, their monasteries acting as centers of both faith and scholarship. Farmers and herders formed the backbone of society, providing food and horses. Merchants and artisans connected these layers, bringing goods to market and supplying towns. The system was less centralized than that of the Song dynasty to the east, but effective enough to hold the realm together across harsh lands. Religion shaped daily rhythms. Families rose with dawn to light incense at household shrines, offering food or flowers before beginning the day's work. In towns, monks walked with begging bowls, receiving rice or bread in return for blessings. Festivals filled the year with processions, dances, and offerings at temples. Prayer flags fluttered in winds that swept the plains, and the chanting of monks echoed from halls where lamps flickered in dim light. For villagers, religion offered both hope of protection from hardship and a link to something larger than themselves. For rulers, it reinforced legitimacy, presenting the emperor as a defender of the faith. Life in Western Jia was not without hardship. The land could be unforgiving. Droughts threatened crops, while floods from the Yellow River sometimes destroyed fields and villages. Sandstorms swept across plains, coating towns in dust. Bandits and raiding tribes occasionally struck caravans or frontier villages, yet the empire endured by adapting. Farmers learned to store surplus grain. Herders moved flocks swiftly when pastures dried, and caravans traveled in guarded groups. The empire's resilience was born not of abundance, but of discipline and cooperation in a difficult land. At its height, Western Jia was respected, if not always loved, by its neighbors. The Song dynasty to the east saw it as both a rival and a trading partner. To the north, the Liao and later the Jin dynasty contended with it for influence over steppe tribes. The Tangut rulers balanced these pressures with tribute and war, sometimes sending horses in exchange for silk. other times raiding borders to remind neighbors of their strength. Their position was precarious, but for over 2 centuries they held it. To imagine Western Jia in its prime is to picture a desert alive with movement. Caravans inching across dunes under blazing suns, their camels swaying with loads of silt. Farmers bending in green patches of irrigated fields, their hands muddy from planting millet. Monks chanting in dim temples, their voices carrying through courtyards painted with sacred murals. Soldiers on horseback patrolling walls of rammed earth, their banners snapping in the wind. Markets buzzing with traders speaking many languages, each seeking profit or safety on the long road. It was a world of dust and faith, hardship and resilience, sustained by a belief that in the desert, order and survival could be carved from sand and water. And yet we pause with a question. Can an empire so dependent on fragile trade routes, so surrounded by greater powers, and so tied to a harsh land endure forever? Or is such a balance always destined to break when the winds of fortune shift? The balance that had sustained Western Jia for 2 centuries was never permanent. Its strength lay in controlling trade routes, negotiating with neighbors, and extracting food from harsh land. But by the 13th century, forces beyond its control gathered at its borders. The Mongols under Genghis Khan were rising on the northern steppes, a storm unlike any the Tangids had faced before. They had seen nomadic raids, wars with the Song, and struggles with the Jin, but nothing compared to the disciplined cavalry armies of the Mongols. At first, the Tangut rulers tried to manage the new power as they had others. They offered tribute, horses, and soldiers, hoping to appease Genghis Khan. The Mongols, however, saw the Tanguts' wealth and strategic position as too important to ignore. Western Jia stood between them and the lands of China, and its fortified cities controlled the passes into the heart of the empire. To the Mongols, the Tanguts were both obstacle and opportunity. The wars began in the early 1200s. Mongol horsemen swept across Tangut lands, burning villages and raiding caravans. The Tanguts resisted, their fortified cities holding out against initial assaults. But Mongol tactics were relentless. They encircled cities, cut off supplies, and waited until hunger forced surrender in open fields. Tangut cavalry could not match the speed and discipline of Mongol horsemen. Step by step, the Mongols pressed deeper, demanding submission. Western Jia rulers alternated between surrender and defiance. At times they agreed to provide troops to the Mongols, fighting alongside them in campaigns against the Jin dynasty. At other times they withheld support, hoping to preserve independence. This wavering proved fatal. Genghis Khan, furious at their betrayal during his final campaigns, ordered their destruction. In 1227, as he lay dying, he commanded that the Tanguts be annihilated so that no trace of their defiance remained. The Mongol assault was devastating. Cities were stormed, walls toppled, and populations slaughtered. Ningxia, the proud capital, was reduced to ruins. Temples were burned. Manuscripts in the Tangut script were destroyed, and monasteries were emptied. Survivors fled into deserts and mountains, but the empire was finished. Unlike other states that the Mongols conquered and absorbed, Western Jia was deliberately erased. Its people were scattered, its culture fragmented, and its name silenced in chronicles for generations. For the ordinary Tanguts, the fall was catastrophic. Farmers saw their fields trampled by cavalry. Families abandoned villages to escape raids, carrying only what they could. Monks fled monasteries, their scriptures destroyed or burned in heaps. Caravans stopped traveling through the land. Fearful of war, what had once been a network of bustling markets became barren stretches of desert. Haunted by memory, for many, survival meant assimilation, blending into Mongol or Chinese society, and losing their language and script with each generation. The silence that followed was profound. While other conquered peoples left behind chronicles, monuments, or continued traditions, the Tanguts nearly vanished. Their script fell out of use, undeciphered for centuries. Their Buddhist art lay buried under sand, unseen until archaeologists uncovered fragments in the 20th century. For a long time, Historians knew of the Mongol destruction of Western Jia only from outside sources, with little voice from the Tangids themselves. It was as if their entire civilization had been swallowed by the desert, erased almost as thoroughly as Genghis Khan had intended. And yet, traces endured. In remote regions, communities preserved fragments of Tangic culture, and ruins scattered across Ningxia and Gansu. Archaeologists found remnants of walls, temples, and tombs. Manuscripts in the Tangic script, though unread for centuries, survive in hidden caches. Slowly, scholars piece together their language, uncovering prayers, poems, and laws that once guided the empire. These fragments revealed a people who had woven together nomadic roots and Buddhist faith, who had sustained themselves in a harsh land by ingenuity and resilience. The fall of Western Jia was not only the end of a dynasty, but also the loss of memory. Unlike the Khmer Empire, remembered through stone temples or Srivijaya, recalled in chronicles and trade records, Western Jia nearly disappeared from history itself. Only in the modern era did its voice begin to return, whispered from ruins and deciphered scripts. Its story is a reminder that civilizations can vanish not only through conquest, but also through the silence that follows when no one remains to tell their tale. To imagine the final days of Ningxia is to picture a city surrounded by dust and fire. Markets, once filled with camels and merchants, lie empty, their stalls overturned. Monks carry statues from temples, only to abandon them when horsemen break through the gates. Families huddle in courtyards, their clay jars empty of grain, listening to the thunder of hooves beyond the walls, and then silence is silence that lasted centuries, broken only by the desert wind sweeping over ruins that once echoed with prayer and trade. And so the Western Jia ended, not with gradual decline, but with deliberate destruction. Its strength in balancing neighbors and trade had sustained it for 2 centuries. But against the Mongols, balance was impossible. What remains is a story of resilience and fragility, of a people who created their own script, faith, and empire in a harsh land, only to be nearly erased. And so we close with a question. When a civilization is silenced so completely, is it truly gone? Or does it live on in the fragments we recover, in the ruins we study, and in the faint memory that whispers across desert sands where an empire once stood? In the heart of the Indonesian archipelago, on the fertile plains of Java, there once thrived an empire that few in the West have ever heard of. Yet in its own age, it stood as one of the greatest maritime powers in the world. The Majapahit Empire, born in the late 13th century and flourishing into the 15th, commanded a realm that stretched across thousands of islands. From its course came fleets of ships that carried rice, spices, and stories to distant lands. From its ports flowed goods that linked Southeast Asia with India, China, and the Middle East. And from its people came legends that even today shape the cultural memory of Indonesia. It was not an empire of stone monuments like Angkor, nor one of desert fortresses like Western Jia, but an empire of rivers, seas, and trade routes, a realm as fluid as the waters that sustained it. The origins of Majapahit lie in turmoil. In the late 1200s, Java was ruled by the Singasari kingdom, a power that had risen by uniting parts of the island and dominating nearby lands. But in 1292, Singasari collapsed under rebellion and invasion. Out of this chaos, a prince named Raden Wijaya carved a new kingdom. With cunning and luck, he founded Majapahit in 1293 on fertile land near the Brantis River, surrounded by rice fields and close to coastal ports. Legend tells that the empire's name came from a bitter fruit called maya that grew in the area, and the word pahit, meaning bitter in Javanese. From these unassuming origins, Majapahit would rise to command much of maritime Southeast Asia. The capital was not a city of stone like Angkor, but a city of brick, wood, and canals. Houses stood with red brick foundations and thatched roofs, shaded by coconut palms and mango trees. Palaces spread with courtyards and pavilions, their wooden beams carved with patterns of flowers and birds. Canals carried water through neighborhoods, linking rice paddies to markets, At dawn, the air filled with the sound of roosters, the smell of wood fires, and the chatter of families preparing rice porridge flavored with palm sugar. Farmers walked barefoot to fields, fishermen launched small boats into rivers, and artisans set to work shaping clay into pots or weaving cloth on looms. Life in Majapahit was inseparable from water. The Brandis River was the empire's lifeline, flowing past villages and towns into the Java Sea. Barges floated downstream, laden with rice, coconuts, and sugar. Sailors guided them with long poles, singing songs to keep rhythm. From coastal ports, larger ships set sail, their hulls built of teak, their sails woven from palm fiber. These ships traveled not only across the archipelago, but also to Malacca, Sumatra, Borneo, and beyond. The sea was both highway and frontier, bringing wealth but also danger. Pirates lurked among islands, and storms could scatter fleets. Yet Majapahit thrived because it mastered the sea, sending its influence as far as the Philippines in the north and the Spice Islands in the east. The empire's rulers understood that control of trade was the key to power. Their realm was rich in rice and forest products, but even more valuable were the spices that grew on distant islands: cloves, nutmeg, and mace, luxuries that filled the holds of ships bound for China and Arabia. By commanding the straits and ports where these goods passed, Majapahit grew wealthy. Taxes on traders filled royal coffers, and with wealth came fleets of ships and armies of soldiers to enforce authority. The empire's reach extended not through endless conquests of land, but through networks of tribute and allegiance. Small kingdoms across the archipelago recognized Majapahit's power, sending gifts of gold, spices, or exotic animals in exchange for protection and trade privileges. Religion added another layer to Majapahit's identity. Its people practiced a blend of Hinduism and Buddhism, brought centuries earlier from India, mixed with older local traditions. Temples of brick and stone rose across Java, decorated with carvings of gods, demons, and mythical creatures. Families prayed to ancestors at household shrines, offering flowers and rice. Kings portrayed themselves as divine rulers, linked to Hindu deities or bodhisattvas. Festivals filled the year, with processions, dances, and offerings. In markets, incense burned beside stalls of rice and fish, and dancers in ornate costumes performed stories from the Ramayana, their graceful movements echoing the epic's cosmic struggles. Daily life was marked by both simplicity and richness. Farmers grew rice in terrace fields carved into hillsides, their irrigation systems precise and communal. Women carried baskets of seedlings into paddies, planting them in rows as water shimmered around their ankles. Men guided buffalo through fields with wooden plows, their bodies glistening with sweat under the sun. In towns, artisans shaped bronze into gongs and bells, instruments that gave rhythm to music and ritual. Traders counted coins of gold and silver, weighing pepper or clove by hand before sealing deals. Children played with carved wooden toys, ran through courtyards, and swam in rivers to escape the heat. At court, life was grander. Nobles wore fine cloth dyed in deep reds and yellows, their garments decorated with gold threads. Courtiers gathered in pavilions with polished floors, where poets recited verses and musicians played gongs, flutes, and drums. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of cicadas from gardens beyond. Rulers received envoys from distant islands, who presented gifts of rare birds, fragrant spices, and ivory. In return, Majapahit sent back its own gifts, asserting its power through generosity as well as strength. Majapahit's golden age came under King Hayam Wuruk in the 14th century, guided by his chief minister, Gayamada, a figure who became legendary for his ambition. Gayamada swore an oath that Majapahit would unite the archipelago under its banner, and through diplomacy and war, he brought many lands into its orbit. Under his leadership, the empire extended its influence across much of maritime Southeast Asia. Though not every island was ruled directly, Majapahit's name was feared and respected. Its fleets carried soldiers to enforce tribute, while its courts projected wealth and culture. It was an empire less of fixed borders and more of flowing networks, united by sea and allegiance. Yet for the common people, life was far less about oaths and fleets than about the steady rhythm of rice and rain. Families rose at dawn, worked in fields until dusk, and ended the day with meals of rice, fish, and vegetables flavored with chili and tamarind. Storytellers recited epics by firelight, children dozed to the sound of crickets, and tomorrow promised the same cycle of work and worship. Majapahit's grandeur was distant, yet its stability shaped every life, ensuring markets had goods, temples had priests, and fields had water. And so we pause with a question. How does an empire built not of walls or deserts, but of rivers and seas, sustain itself when waters are always shifting, when winds change, and when allegiance can be as fluid as the tide itself? In the 14th century, Majapahit reached its golden age, a period when its fleets ruled the seas. Its courts dazzled with wealth and ceremony, and its culture blossomed into poetry, art, and ritual that still echo in Indonesian memory today. It was an empire whose power stretched not through endless armies of land, but across the currents of the ocean, binding together dozens of islands and peoples into a web of allegiance and trade. At its heart were the figures King Hyam Wuruk, who reigned from 1350 to 1389, and his chief minister, Gaya Mada, a man whose ambition and discipline carried Majapahit into legend. The capital at this time was a city alive with activity. Along the Brandis River, barges floated past markets where merchants sold rice, coconuts, bananas, and bundles of spices. The air was rich with the smell of palm sugar boiling in clay pots, fish grilling on skewers, and incense wafting from shrines. Courtyards echoed with the clang of blacksmiths hammering bronze into gongs, the creak of looms weaving silk and cotton, and the chatter of storytellers reciting old Javanese epics. Women sold baskets of fruit and jars of palm wine, while children splashed in canals or followed processions of monks moving slowly through streets. In the palace, life moved at another rhythm. Nobles and courtiers entered wide pavilions shaded by carved wooden beams, their walls hung with tapestries and their floors polished to a shine. Musicians played gongs, drums, and bamboo flutes as dancers moved with precise grace, their arms and fingers flowing like water. Poets read verses that celebrated kings and gods, weaving tales of creation, duty, and fate. The king himself sat on a throne of carved wood inlaid with gold, his robes dyed deep red and yellow, his head adorned with a crown of gold filigree. Around him, courtiers bowed, envoys presented tribute, and ministers whispered counsel. Gaya Mada, the chief minister, was the true architect of Majapahit's expansion, a man of humble origins who rose through discipline and loyalty. He swore what became known as the Palapa Oath, declaring that he would not taste spices until Majapahit had united the archipelago. His ambition drove fleets to distant islands, compelling rulers to submit tribute or face the empire's ships. Under his guidance, Majapahit projected power across Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Sulawesi, the Moluccas, and even the Philippines. While not all lands were ruled directly, their rulers recognized Majapahit's supremacy, sending gifts of gold, cloves, nutmeg, and exotic birds to its court. These fleets were not only tools of war, but also symbols of wealth and order. Ships built of teak and palm fiber sailed with dozens of sailors, their hulls wide enough to carry rice, soldiers, or cargo of spices. When a fleet arrived in a foreign port, its sails filled the horizon, its drums beat in rhythm, and its presence demanded respect. For smaller kingdoms, submission was often less costly than resistance. For Majapahit controlled trade routes that were essential to survival. Yet submission also brought benefits: access to Majapahit markets, protection from pirates, and recognition by a power whose name reached even China's imperial court. Daily life across Majapahit's realm reflected this mixture of local independence and imperial influence. On Java's fertile plains, farmers continued their cycles of planting and harvesting rice, their fields shimmering with water under the sun. Families worked communally, building and maintaining irrigation dikes, sharing harvests, and storing surplus grain in granaries. In villages, temples of brick and stone rose among palm groves, where priests performed rituals blending Hindu, Buddhist, and indigenous traditions. Offerings of rice, flowers, and incense were placed on small altars, while larger festivals filled entire villages with music, dance, and shadow puppet plays that retold the epics of Ramayana and Mahabharata in a distinctly Javanese style. On distant islands, the influence of Majapahit was felt in tribute missions and the circulation of goods. Rulers of Sumatra and the Moluccas sent spices and gold to Java, receiving cloth, rice, and recognition in return. Traders in Borneo exported camphor and forest products, while in the Spice Islands cloves and nutmeg were harvested and carried across seas by Majapahita's fleets. For local people, these exchanges brought new goods: porcelain from China, cotton from India, and even glass and ceramics from Arabia. A villager in a small island port might have eaten rice grown in Java, stored it in a Chinese jar, and seasoned it with cloves harvested from nearby groves, all tied together by the empire's networks. Religion at the height of Majapahit was both cosmopolitan and deeply local. Hinduism and Buddhism coexisted, their temples standing side by side, their rituals often blending. Kings were described as incarnations of Hindu gods, yet also patrons of Buddhist monks. The court sponsored great ceremonies that invoked divine protection for the empire, while in villages, simpler rituals honored ancestors and local spirits. This blend created a unique spiritual world, where epic tales from India mingled with Javanese legends, and where cosmic order was seen not as distant but woven into daily life. Art and literature flourished. Court poets composed long kakawin, epic poems in Old Javanese, filled with metaphors and intricate rhythms. Dancers trained for years to perform in courts, their movements codified and symbolic. Sculptors carved figures of gods, demons, and mythical creatures into temple walls, while painters decorated manuscripts with scenes of epics. Music echoed across palaces and temples, with ensembles of gongs, metallophones, and drums laying the foundation for what would later become the melon. These arts were not only entertainment, but also acts of devotion, offerings to gods, and symbols of imperial greatness. Yet behind the grandeur, life for commoners remained simple and repetitive. Farmers labored in fields, artisans in workshops, traders on boats, and women in households where they wove, cooked, and raised children. A day might begin with lighting incense at a family shrine, continue with hours spent under the sun in a paddy, and end with storytelling under the stars. For many, Majapahit's greatness was distant, felt in taxes and obligations, or in festivals when envoys and nobles passed through villages. But even if far removed from court life, they were part of a vast system that connected them to lands and peoples they would never see. Majapahit's strength was not unshakable. Its vast reach depended on networks of loyalty, tribute, and trade, all of which could shift with changing winds. Pirates threatened shipping lanes, rival kingdoms plotted rebellion, and distant islands sometimes withheld tribute. Even within Java, noble families and provinces had their own ambitions. Gayamada's iron will held the system together for a time, but it was a system always in motion, as fluid as the seas on which it rested. To imagine Majapahit at its height is to picture a capital alive with processions, nobles in fine robes carrying offerings, dancers moving in rhythm to gongs, sailors preparing fleets on rivers, and envoys from distant islands kneeling before the king. It is to picture villages where farmers waited in rice fields while storytellers recited the Ramayana. In shadow plays by lamplight, it is to picture ships sailing under stars, their decks crowded with sacks of rice and bundles of cloves, linking islands in an endless chain of exchange. And so we pause with a question: can an empire whose foundations lie in tides and trade and tribute, and allegiance rather than stone walls and fixed borders, endure the shifting winds of history? Or is it always destined to scatter like ships in a storm once its leaders falter? The greatness of Majapahit, like the tides on which it depended, did not last forever. Its wealth was built on rice harvest from fertile fields, tribute from distant islands, and control of sea routes that carried the world's spices. Yet all of these foundations were fragile, shifting with winds, ambitions, and the rise of rivals. By the late 15th century, the empire that had once commanded the seas of Southeast Asia was in decline, its memory already beginning to slip into legend. The first signs of strain appeared within its own court. The balance that King Hayam Warwick and his minister Gayamata had maintained depended on unity between nobles, provinces, and fleets. But after their deaths in the late 14th century, rivalries deepened. Princes contested succession, ministers pursued their own ambitions, and the delicate web of allegiance began to fray. Some provinces withheld tribute, others sought independence, and the vast network that had bound islands to Java grew weaker. In a realm where power depended on loyalty as much as force, the cracks widened quickly. Religion, too, shifted in ways that reshaped the empire. For centuries, Majapahit had been a realm of Hindu-Buddhist blending, its temples filled with statues of gods and bodhisattvas, its festivals retelling epic stories in music and dance. But new faiths were arriving along the trade routes. Islam spread through traders, scholars, and missionaries who landed in ports from Sumatra to Java. In coastal towns, Muslim merchants built mosques beside markets, offering not only goods, but also a faith that emphasized community, trade, and simplicity. For rulers inland of Majapahit's court, this new religion was first seen as foreign, but for many on the coasts, it offered a new identity tied to the wider Indian Ocean world. Over time, more and more ports shifted allegiance, linking themselves to Muslim sultanates rather than to Majapahit. Trade itself was also changing. The rise of Malacca on the Malay Peninsula drew merchants who once passed through Majapahit's ports. Malacca, with its sheltered harbor and Islamic rulers, became the new hub of maritime trade, recognized by both Chinese emperors and Arab merchants. Ships that once paid tribute to Majapahit now found more profit and protection by docking at Malacca. The flow of wealth that had filled Majapahit's coffers ebbed away, leaving its fleets and armies underfunded. An empire built on controlling trade could not endure. When trade routes slipped from its grasp, for ordinary people, the decline was less dramatic but still felt. Farmers continued planting rice in paddies, tending buffalo, and drying grain in courtyards. Artisans still shaped bronze gongs and wove cloth, and storytellers still performed shadow plays by lamplight. But markets grew quieter as fewer. Foreign ships docked in Javanese ports. Taxes grew heavier as rulers tried to extract more from villages to sustain the court. In coastal towns, mosques began to rise beside old temples, the call to prayer mixing with the sound of gongs. Families found themselves caught between traditions, honoring ancestors at shrines while also embracing new rituals of Islam. Life continued, but the empire's grandeur was slipping away, piece by piece. Legends preserved in later chronicles speak of Majapahit's last days as filled with intrigue and betrayal. Civil wars broke out among princes, and rival claimants to the throne divided the realm. Coastal sultanates declared independence, sometimes with the support of Muslim merchants and missionaries. Fleets that once sailed under Majapahit's banners now fought against each other, fragmenting the unity that had once bound the archipelago. By the early 16th century, the empire that had stretched across islands was reduced to a shadow, its authority limited to inland Java. The final blow came not in one great battle, but in the slow erosion of power. By the time Europeans arrived in Southeast Asia in the early 1500s, they heard only stories of Majapahit's greatness. Portuguese sailors learned from locals that there had once been a mighty Javanese empire that ruled the seas. But by then it was gone, replaced by coastal Muslim sultanates and new centers of trade. What had been one of the largest and most influential empires in maritime Asia had faded into memory. And yet, Majapahit was not forgotten. Its cultural legacy lived on in literature, language, and art. The Kakawin poems composed at its court remained revered texts, Shadow puppet plays continue to retell the epics that had once graced its palaces. The memory of Gayamada's oath to unite the islands endured as a symbol of ambition and unity. In later centuries, Indonesian nationalists would look back to Majapahit as proof that the archipelago had once been united, drawing on its memory to inspire modern identity. What had once been a forgotten maritime realm became, in hindsight, a source of pride and imagination. To imagine Majapahit's decline is to see its capital slowly emptying of envoys and tribute. The courtyards that once rang with music are now quieter, and the fleets that once filled rivers no longer sail to distant islands. Nobles whispering of succession disputes, merchants choosing to sail to Malacca instead, and farmers feeling the burden of heavier taxes. Villages carried on their rituals as always, but since that, the world beyond was shifting. And in coastal towns, the rising sound of prayer from new mosques marked a new era, even as old temples fell silent. The ruins of Majapahit are not as grand as Angkor's stone towers, nor as haunting as the desert walls of western Jia. Brick foundations crumble beneath trees, canals sailed over, and village life flows on above the remnants of what was once an empire. But its memory endures in chronicles, poems, and stories passed through generations, reminders of a time when Java commanded seas and islands with fleets and tribute. And so the story of Majapahit closes not with sudden collapse but with transformation. Its people did not vanish but adapted, shifting into new kingdoms, new faiths, and new trade routes. The empire itself disappeared, but its memory lived on, shaping identity long after its palaces had crumbled. And so we end with a question. Is the greatness of an empire measured by how long it lasts or by the way its memory endures, inspiring those who come centuries later to imagine unity, ambition, and possibility in the islands that once carried its name? Long before global trade was carried by ships across oceans, it was carried on the backs of camels across deserts and mountains. At the heart of this overland network stood a people whose name is now nearly forgotten, but whose influence once stretched from China to the Mediterranean. These were the Sogdians, a people of Central Asia whose cities flourished between the 4th and 9th centuries, and whose merchants became the lifeblood of the Silk Road. They were not conquerors or emperors, but traders, translators, and cultural go-betweens. For centuries, they connected east and west, carrying silk, glass, spices, music, and ideas across half the world. The homeland of the Sogdians lay in the fertile valleys of Sogdiana, in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Here, rivers flowing from the Pamir and Tianshan mountains cut through dry plains, creating oases where towns and cities could thrive. Samarkand and Bukhara were the jewels of this land, fortified towns surrounded by orchards and fields of wheat, barley, and vines. To live in a Sogdian city was to live at a crossroads. Caravans arrived from the east carrying bowls of Chinese silk, their camels swaying under loads. From the west came Roman glass, Persian silver, and Byzantine coins. From India arrived spices, cotton, and ivory. Every street echoed with the languages of merchants. Every market smelled of incense, wool, and dried fruit. Daily life for the Sogdians was rooted in both trade and agriculture. Farmers worked the fields with wooden plows drawn by oxen, irrigating crops with canals that spread water from rivers into dry soil. Orchards bore apricots, pomegranates, and grapes, which were dried into raisins for caravans. Vineyards produced wine that was traded across Asia, carried in clay jars to markets as far as China. Artisans shaped bronze, silver, and glass, their workshops filled with the clang of hammers and the heat of kilns. Weavers spun wool and silk into garments dyed in bright colors. In the evenings, families gathered in courtyards shaded by vines, sharing bread baked in clay ovens, lamb stews flavored with herbs, and wine poured into carved cups. But the Sogdians were not only farmers and artisans, they were above all merchants, famed for their trade skill. Young men often left their homes in Samarkand or Bukhara to travel east along caravan routes, sometimes spending years in foreign lands before returning. Sogdian merchants established colonies in distant cities, in the markets of Chang'an in China, on the steppes of Mongolia, and in the bazaars of Persia. Wherever they went, they served as translators and middlemen, linking cultures that could not otherwise speak to one another. They learned the languages of their neighbors, Chinese, Persian, Turkic tongues, and carried contracts, letters, and accounts across borders. For rulers, they were indispensable. For other traders, they were guides through a dangerous and vast world. The caravans they led were epic in scale. Hundreds of camels might travel together, each laden with bundles of silk, sacks of spices, or jars of wine. Horses carried riders armed with bows to protect against bandits. Along the way, the caravan stopped at caravanserai, roadside inns with courtyards where animals could rest. Merchants could eat bread and stew, and guards could share news of the road. Nights were spent beneath desert stars, fires glowing as merchants sang songs and told tales of faraway cities. In the mountains, caravans crossed narrow passes, where winds howled and snow fell even in summer. In deserts, they trudged for days across dunes, following wells known only to experienced guides. Each journey carried immense risk, storms, bandits, disease, or betrayal. But the prophets made it worthwhile. Religion was central to Sogdian identity, but it was never singular. Their homeland lay at the meeting point of many faiths, and the Sogdians embraced them all. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion of fire and duality, was widely practiced, with temples where sacred flames burned. Buddhism spread into their lands, bringing monasteries and statues of the Buddha. Christianity, carried by Nestorian missionaries, found followers among merchants. Even Manichaeism, a faith blending ideas of light and darkness, took root. To be Sogdian was often to be multilingual and multi-faith, able to adapt to whichever culture one traded with. This flexibility made them invaluable on the Silk Road, where belief and language were as important as goods. In Chinese records, the Sogdians appear as indispensable traders. They carried horses from the steppes, jade from Central Asia, glass from Rome, and silk from China. They served as translators at courts, diplomats between kingdoms, and entertainers in cities. Chinese poems describe Sogdian musicians playing lutes and flutes in taverns, their songs filling the air of Chang'an. They introduced Central Asian dances and foods to China, blending cultures with every step. To the Chinese, the Sogdians were both exotic foreigners and trusted allies, a people who brought the world to their door. Yet behind this glamour was the hardship of a life spent on the road. A Sogdian merchant might spend years away from his family, crossing deserts where thirst claimed many, or watching camels collapse under loads in the heat. Letters preserved from the Silk Road show merchants writing home to wives and children, begging for news, worrying about money, or reporting losses. For every successful caravan that reached its destination, another fell to bandits, storms, or betrayal. Profit and ruin were always a breath apart. Still, the Sogdians endured, for they understood something vital. The trade was not just the movement of goods, but of culture. With every bolt of silk, they carried stories. With every jar of wine, they carried songs. Their role was not only economic, but also cultural, weaving together the tapestry of Eurasia long before the modern world imagined global trade. And so we pause with a question. How could a people so vital to the lifeblood of the Silk Road, whose merchants once commanded respect from China to Byzantium, vanish so completely from common memory, leaving behind little more than ruins and fragments of letters buried in the sands? For centuries the Sogdians thrived, their caravans carrying silk, wine, glass, and faith across thousands of miles. They were the indispensable middlemen of the Silk Road, the guides and translators who turned distant worlds into neighbors. Yet no network, however vast, is unbreakable. By the 9th century, the Sogdians' dominance was waning. Empires rose and fell around them, trade shifted, and new powers took their place. The people who had once carried the lifeblood of Eurasia slowly disappeared into the pages of history. The first great blow came from conquest. In the 8th century, the expanding Arab armies of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates pushed deep into Central Asia. Sogdiana, with its cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, was drawn into the orbit of the Islamic world. At first, the Sogdians resisted. Chronicles speak of uprisings in Samarkand, of nobles who clung to old Zoroastrian or Buddhist traditions, and of merchants caught between loyalty to their heritage and the pressure of new rulers. But over generations, Islam spread through cities and caravan routes, brought not only by soldiers but also by traders and scholars. Slowly, Sogdian temples fell silent, replaced by mosques, and the sacred flames of Zoroastrianism dimmed. Conversion was both faith and pragmatism. To join the new Islamic order meant access to markets, protection, and status. With Islam came a shift in identity. The Sogdian language, once the lingua franca of the Silk Road, began to fade. Arabic and Persian took its place in contracts, letters, and religious texts. Children in Samarkand learned to recite the Quran in Arabic, rather than memorize Zoroastrian prayers in Sogdian. Merchants still traded, but now as part of a larger Islamic world, rather than as a distinct Sogdian network. Their role as cultural brokers declined. For Islam itself provided a shared language and faith across much of the Silk Road, reducing the need for middlemen. Trade itself was changing as well. New routes rose to prominence, some bypassing Sogdiana entirely. The Silk Road had always been fragile, dependent on peace between empires. When wars broke out between the Tang dynasty in China and the Tibetan Empire, caravans faltered. When the Abbasid Caliphate shifted its focus toward maritime trade across the Indian Ocean, fewer goods flowed overland. Ports on the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea began to rival the caravan trails, as ships carried silk, spices, and porcelain by sea, faster and safer than by camel. The Sogdians, masters of overland trade, found their networks thinning. Within China, the Sogdians faced both acceptance and suspicion. For centuries they had been welcome as musicians, merchants, and envoys. But in 755, the Inlushan rebellion brought suspicion upon them. Some Sogdians supported the rebel general Inlushan, himself of mixed Sogdian heritage. When the rebellion failed, Chinese officials blamed Sogdian communities, and many were persecuted or forced to assimilate. Their neighborhoods in Chang'an emptied, their temples closed, and their identity blurred into the broader fabric of Tang society. Though individual families survived, the distinct Sogdian presence diminished. By the 10th century, the Sogdians as a people were fading from history. Their cities remained Samarkand, Bukhara, Penjikent, but their culture merged into the Persian Islamic world. Their language was spoken less and less until it vanished, replaced by Persian. Their faiths, once diverse, gave way to Islam. Their merchant networks, once the lifeblood of the Silk Road, were replaced by Muslim, Turkic, and Persian traders who carried goods across new routes. What remained of the Sogdian name were scattered references and chronicles, fragments of letters buried in desert sands, and ruins of temples crumbling into dust. And yet, traces endured. Archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered murals from Penjikent, vivid scenes of feasts, battles, and epics painted on plaster walls. These showed Sogdians in colorful robes, drinking wine, playing music, and telling stories, a glimpse into a world that had vanished. Letters written in Sogdian script, found in desert ruins, revealed merchants worrying about debts, longing for home, and describing the dangers of caravan life. Coins, glassware, and ceramics discovered along trade routes bore witness to their far-reaching networks. Though their voice was lost for centuries, their fingerprints remained scattered across the Silk Road. For ordinary Sogdians, the decline meant adaptation. A farmer in the Zirafshan Valley still plowed his fields, but his prayers shifted from Zoroastrian fires to Islamic verses. A merchant still joined caravans, but now he carried contracts in Persian and spoke the language of the Caliphate. A musician still played his lute in Chinese taverns, but he was no longer seen as Sogdian, only as another foreign entertainer. Their identity dissolved not in sudden destruction, but in gradual assimilation. Like a caravan fading into the horizon, each step quieter until it is gone. To imagine the end of the Sogdians is to see Samarkand transformed from a Sogdian city into an Islamic Persian one. Its bazaars filled with goods as always, but its language, faith, and culture shifted. To see Bukhar's fire temples replaced by mosques, their flames extinguished. To see caravanserais still busy, but with fewer letters and Sogdian script carried along the road. The Silk Road continued, but its masters were gone, their role taken by others. And yet, perhaps the Sogdians never truly disappeared. Their influence lived on in the very fabric of Eurasian culture. They had introduced wine to China, music to courts, and words into languages. They had been the weavers of networks that shaped centuries of exchange. Even if their name was forgotten, their impact remained, hidden in the habits, foods, and traditions that traveled with them. And so we end with a thought. The Sogdians remind us that not all great powers are built on armies or monuments. Some are built on trust, reputation, and the courage to walk endlessly across deserts with caravans. They remind us that history is not only the story of kings and conquests, but also of merchants, translators, and ordinary families who carried the world in their packs. Their empire was not of stone, but of movement, and though it vanished, it shaped the world in ways we still carry, often without knowing. And so the question remains, when a people's memory fades, but their influence endures in every road song and trade they touched, are they truly gone, or do they live on in the unseen connections that still bind the world together? By the 6th century BCE, Lydia had reached the height of its power, and its name was synonymous with wealth. At the center of this golden age stood King Croesus, whose riches were so legendary that they became a proverb in the ancient world. To say someone was as rich as Croesus was to say they had reached the pinnacle of fortune. Yet his kingdom was more than gold piled in treasuries. It was a realm where innovation, trade, and diplomacy blended, where markets thrived, and where ordinary people felt the reach of prosperity even in their simple lives. Sardis, the Lydian capital, gleamed under Croesus' reign. The city sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, one leading east into the Persian heartlands, another west toward the Greek cities on the coast, and still others north and south into Anatolia. Its walls, built of stone and earth, rose above the plain, and within them sprawled palaces, temples, and markets. The Pactolus River still carried grains of gold through its waters, collected by panning and washing, and artisans in Sardis turned this wealth into coins, jewelry, and ornaments that dazzled visiting envoys. Travelers described markets where jars of olive oil from the coast stood beside sacks of Lydian grain, where Greek pottery was traded for woolen cloth, and where coins clinked as they passed. From hand to hand, life for the wealthy elite in Sardis was marked by luxury. Nobles dined on lamb, roasted with herbs, bread dipped in olive oil, and wine flavored with honey. Banquets featured musicians playing lyres and flutes, dancers performing stories of gods, and poets reciting verses. Courtyards were decorated with mosaics and fountains, while garments were woven from fine wool and dyed in bright colors. Gold jewelry, shaped into bracelets, earrings, and pendants, glittered in lamplight. For the first time in history, coins made such luxuries easier to purchase and exchange, creating a sense of fluid wealth that could be stored, spent, or gifted. Yet beyond the palace walls, daily life retained its rhythms of toil and simplicity. Farmers in valleys plowed with oxen, sowed barley, and tended orchards of figs and pomegranates. Shepherds guided flocks across hillsides, spinning wool that would become the cloth of Sardis markets. Women baked bread in clay ovens, their hands dusted with flour, while children fetched water from wells or chased goats through village lanes. Villages clustered around small shrines to local gods, where families prayed for rain or fertility, offering bread, oil, or coins at altars. For many, the arrival of coinage meant more security. Surplus grain could be sold for coins stored in clay jars, creating savings for leaner years. Religion bound the kingdom together. The goddess Cybele, the mother of mountains and fertility, remained central. Her worship marked by drums, flutes, and ecstatic rituals. Temples dedicated to her dotted the landscape, their altars smoking with sacrifices of animals, fruits, and wine. Other gods, borrowed or blended with Greek deities, filled the Lydian pantheon. Apollo and Artemis were worshipped alongside older Anatolian spirits, reflecting Lydia's position as a bridge between cultures. Priests oversaw festivals that drew entire communities, with processions, music, and offerings that connected the wealth of kings to the devotion of farmers. Croesus understood the power of wealth. In diplomacy, he used his fortune to cement alliances with Greek city-states along the coast, sponsoring temples at Delphi and other sanctuaries. Greek writers later described him as a generous patron, offering gifts of gold to oracles and shrines. To the Greeks, Croesus was both benefactor and rival, a foreign king whose wealth could dazzle but whose ambitions threatened their independence. Relations between Lydia and the Ionian Greek cities were complex. At times, Lydia dominated them, demanding tribute, while at other times it courted them as allies against larger powers to the east. The east was where Croesus faced his greatest challenge. Beyond Lydia lay the rising power of Persia, under Cyrus the Great. At first, Croesus sought to secure his realm through alliances and gifts. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, famously asking whether he should attack Persia. The oracle's cryptic reply that if he crossed the river, he would destroy a great empire gave him confidence. He did not realize, until too late, that the empire destroyed would be his own. For ordinary Lydians, politics with Persia were distant matters, but trade with Persians was not. Markets in Sardis filled with Persian textiles, spices, and animals, while Lydian goods flowed eastward. Caravans carried wool, silver, and wine into Persia, returning with exotic goods that enriched Sardis markets. Alongside this exchange came ideas, stories, and customs. Merchants and travelers carried news of Persian expansion, of Cyrus' conquests, and of wars fought on far horizons. In taverns and workshops, Lydians debated what it meant for their small but wealthy kingdom to sit between great powers. Despite looming threats, life in Lydia during Croesus' reign was marked by prosperity. Farmers harvested abundant crops, markets bustled, and artisans thrived. In villages, children played along riverbanks where flecks of gold glimmered in sand. In cities, priests lit lamps at Cybele's shrines, musicians played for nobles in candlelit halls, and coins passed between hands in transactions that felt both ordinary and revolutionary. The idea that value could be standardized, carried, and trusted in stamped metal changed how people thought about wealth itself. To imagine Lydia at its height is to see both splendor and simplicity. Palaces filled with treasures from Greece and Persia, courts echoing with music and poetry, and temples smoking with sacrifices. Villages where farmers bent over fields, shepherds guided flocks, and women wove wool into cloth. Markets where Greek traders bartered pottery for Lydian wool. Persian merchants sold spices, and coins clinked as symbols of trust. And in the distance, the Pactolus River flowing steadily, its sand still gleaming with grains of gold that fueled both fortune and fate. And so we pause with a question. How could a kingdom that seemed so secure in its wealth, that dazzled neighbors and inspired legends, fall so quickly once its riches drew the gaze of greater empires? The story of Lydia's decline is one of wealth turning into weakness, of a kingdom whose treasures made it famous but also made it a target. Under King Croesus, Lydia had reached its height, its markets bustling, its coins circulating across the Aegean and Anatolia, its palaces glittering with gold. But prosperity can breed overconfidence, and Croesus believed his riches could secure him against any rival. To the east, however, a new power was rising, one that valued not wealth displayed in treasuries but disciplined armies and the vision of empire. That power was Persia under Cyrus the Great. At first, Lydia and Persia were distant neighbors, separated by mountains and by the smaller states of Anatolia. But as Cyrus conquered Media and Babylonia, his empire expanded westward until Lydia stood directly in his path. Croesus sought alliances to strengthen his position. He sent gifts of gold to sanctuaries in Greece, consulted the oracle at Delphi, and negotiated with Egypt and Babylon. He hoped to bind powerful allies against the Persians, confident in his wealth and allies. He eventually marched east to confront Cyrus. The famous story goes that Croesus asked the oracle at Delphi whether he should attack Persia. The oracle replied that if he crossed the river, he would destroy a great empire. Taking this as a promise of victory, Croesus advanced. In truth, the prophecy was fulfilled, but it was Lydia, not Persia, that fell. The two armies met on the plains of Anatolia around 547 BCE. Croesus's forces were formidable, with heavily armed cavalry and mercenaries from his allies. But Cyrus' army was disciplined, experienced from years of conquest. One account tells that Cyrus used camels in battle. Their scent and appearance startling the Lydian horses, causing panic among Croesus' cavalry. Whatever the details, Lydia's army was broken, and Croesus retreated to Sardis. The city, though strong, fell after a brief siege. For the people of Sardis, the fall must have been sudden and shocking. Markets that once rang with coins and voices fell silent as Persian troops marched through the streets. Palaces were plundered, temples seized, and Croesus himself captured. Some stories say he was placed on a pyre, only to be spared at the last moment by Cyrus, who admired his courage. Other accounts suggest he lived out his days as an advisor in the Persian court. Whatever the truth, Lydia was no more. Yet even in conquest, Persia recognized the value of Lydia's innovations. Cyrus kept Sardis as a major city, integrating it into the Achaemenid Empire. The Lydian coinage system was preserved and spread, refined under Persian rule. Gold darics and silver sigilloi, coins of Persia, were modeled on Lydian examples. Thus, even as Lydia disappeared as an independent kingdom, its invention lived on, shaping economies from Persia to Greece for ordinary Lydians. Life after conquest changed, but also continued. Farmers still plowed fields, shepherds still grazed flocks, and artisans still wove wool and shaped pottery. Taxes were now collected in the name of the Persian king rather than Croesus. Temples still smoked with sacrifices, though now Persian officials oversaw the city. Some Lydians found new roles as administrators or merchants within the vast Persian Empire, traveling further than ever before. Others stayed in villages. Their lives little changed except for the authority under which they lived. Religion adapted as well. Cybele remained honored, her shrines filled with offerings. But Persian gods and rituals also entered the land. Zoroastrian fire temples appeared, their flames burning alongside the older cults. The blending of beliefs reflected Lydia's position at the crossroads, now more firmly bound into a greater empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. Though the kingdom was gone, Lydia's memory lingered in legend. Greek writers later told stories of Croesus' wealth and downfall, using him as a warning against arrogance. Herodotus recounted his tale as a lesson in the limits of human fortune, that no man, however rich, could escape fate. For the Greeks, Croesus became a figure both admirable and tragic, a king whose generosity to oracles and temples was famous, but whose misreading of prophecy cost him his kingdom. The coin, however, was Lydia's most enduring gift. What began as stamped lumps of electrum in Sardis spread across the Mediterranean and Near East. Greek city-states adopted coinage, stamping their own emblems onto silver drachmas. Persians refined it further, producing gold coins that became symbols of imperial power. Over centuries, coins became the universal language of trade, the trusted medium that allowed economies to flourish. Today, when coins clink in pockets, they carry a faint echo of the Pactolus River and the artisans of Sardis, who first gave metal a stamped value. To imagine Lydia's final days is to picture Sardis under Persian banners. Markets still open, but the clink of coins now includes Persian designs. Farmers are still bringing grain, but paying taxes to new rulers. Priests still burn incense at Cybele shrines, but alongside Persian rituals. Families still tell stories of Croesus, the king who once filled palaces with gold, now reduced to legend. And along the river, flecks of gold still catching in sand, silent reminders of a wealth that could not save a kingdom. The ruins of Sardis remain today, with broken walls, fragments of temples, and faint traces of streets. To walk among them is to feel both presence and absence. The grandeur of a city that once defined wealth, and the silence of a kingdom erased by empire. Yet in every coin we touch, Lydia's spirit endures. Its kingdom was conquered, but its idea changed the world. And so we close with a reflection. The Lydians remind us that innovation can outlast conquest, that ideas can survive even when kingdoms fall. Their coins carry trust, value, and connection across cultures. Though their name is nearly forgotten, their legacy is in every transaction we make today. And so the question remains, is a kingdom truly gone if its greatest invention lives on in every pocket of the modern world?